Maggie. I'm a licensed clinical psychotherapist with degrees in psychology, theology, and marriage and family therapy, a national certification in dialectical behavioral therapy, and a national certification in integrative mental health. In this video, I'm not looking to diagnose anyone. I'm only willing to offer insight into situations like these. Hello, everybody. We are here today to talk about missing Hebrews, which I know is going to cause a problem. So I am going to play that disclaimer that I play. But first and foremost, before I do that, I want to say hi to some people who are here in the chat. Adrian is first. He says it's on. Auntie is here. Hi with peace signs. Hi, my favorite auntie. Vincent is here. Language. Adric says, let's hear it for the dancing Maggies. Chef Mike is here. Happy Sunday to you as well. Keith is here. Thank you for being here. He says, wow, nice moves. And I will do that dance, just not on a live. So shout out to the live tribe. This is the best live tribe on YouTube, bar none. JB Designs is here. Hi, JB Designs. So for those of you watching from the clouds, feel free to say hello. Again, best live tribe on YouTube. Just be appropriate and you will be welcomed. And shout out to the replay gang. So before we get too started, I'm going to play that disclaimer that I always have to play. It is not anti-Semitic to point out that certain elites throughout history, including the Khazar ruling class, have strategically adopted Judaism not as a matter of faith, but as a tool for political sovereignty, identity control, and economic insulation. Just as the Vatican weaponized Christianity to justify imperial expansion and the British Crown cloaked colonization in divine monarchy, some elite families used Jewish identity not to elevate a people, but to shield their own power. Critiquing those historical power moves is not a hatred of Jews. It is a rejection of using any religion, Judaism included, as a camouflage for conquest, manipulation, and unearned legitimacy. If you can call out papal tyranny without being anti-Christian or condemn Western colonialism without being anti-European, then you can damn well expose elite identity fraud without being anti-Semitic. The real anti-Semitism is pretending all Jewish people share the guilt of a few who turned sacred identity into a political weapon. There's my disclaimer. All right, we got the disclaimer out of the way, okay? So if anybody wants to come into the comments and tell me that I'm anti-Semitic and I'm this and that and all these other things that I get accused of being, I will always point them back to that disclaimer. So if you've been following along, the last part that Adrian and I did with this was presenting a lot of proof of Black people being in the Americas, specifically North America, prior to Columbus, although, he didn't actually come here, but prior to the Spanish and the Europeans coming to the North American continent. So we did a lot of work on that. We talked about that a lot. And that was part one of the missing Hebrews part. So today we're going to get more into the Hebrews part of that. But before we do, there was a video that I wanted to show at the end. And I think it'll kind of bring everybody up to speed if they missed the last one, or, it's also a good recap Hi, Spain Man. Thanks for being here. So I'm going to play this real quick.
I just want to comment on some of the disagreements that are going on social media about who can and cannot call themselves Native Americans. To say that, all natives were one phenotype or one race is disingenuous when you think about history, geography. My paternal grandfather was born in Orangeburg, South Carolina, dark-skinned man. But when my brother went and took his DNA, it came back that he was indigenous to Colombia, South America. His people were slaves in South Carolina. But he's native to the Americas. They're native to the Americas, and they're not light-skinned. They weren't mixed. And my grandmother was a Bonaparte. Her people came here after Napoleon was beat, during the Haitian Revolution. They were either came or were brought here from Haiti. They were slaves in South Carolina. And they were called colored. They weren't called African. They were called colored. In records that the Europeans left themselves. And my native ancestors in Virginia and Pennsylvania, they were redesignated, racially redesignated as mulatto, colored, Negro, or black. That is what the colonizers did after they came here.
Interesting, huh? Very interesting. So, that kind of sums up, where we were at with that. But I want to go through, since, we're trying to recap, right? I want to go through real quick some evidence that I have for both that there were Black natives in the Americas. This is not saying that the only natives or the only Aboriginal were Black. I've seen people say that. There's way too much archaeological evidence that there were the Siberian Native Americans. I mean, they were here for 20,000 years or so it's fine to say that. Nobody's trying to replace anybody. Oh, for God's sakes. So I want to kind of just run through a little bit of evidence that I have before we get into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to talk about today. So tribes in the Southeast and the Midwest used not only Afro-Indigenous, but Hebrew-like inscriptions. So that it's the Back Creek Stone in Tennessee. Okay. If anybody wants to look into it. Okay. Practices such as Passover, ritual purification, and ark shrines were part of Native religious life. And that was interpreted by early chronicles, right, as Israelite survivals. That's what they said it was, okay? Oral traditions of groups like the Black Seminoles, and we talked about that last time, trace their ancestry to both Native and African lineages, but the shared Hebrew identification suggests a single older root. Interesting, huh? So some sources that you guys can look into that I've used that would be good if you want to take this a little farther. James Adair in 1775 wrote The History of the American Indians. Hi, Andrea. Thank you for being here. Adair argues that southeastern tribes were descendants of Israelites and describes customs paralleling Mosaic law. And digitized versions are available via the internet. You don't have to pay for that. It's in the Internet Archive.gov and the Library of Congress. Census records, you can always look at census records. So as an example, we talked about the Nipmuc last time. So the Nipmuc were listed as Indian in 1860 census, and then they were reclassified as colored by the 1870 census, and eventually were reclassified as Negro, so enslavable. Okay, that's available through the U.S. Census Bureau archives and even Ancestry.com databases. You can look through those. MyHeritage also has a lot of good information. They also have a lot of the manifests of slave ships, heritage.com. It's weird because that's a Mormon company, but they have them. All right. And then John Wesley Powell, he wrote for the Smithsonian in the late 1800s. His Ethnological Bureau reports noted that native tribes listed as colored or mulatto were Black. That is in federal documents. And then annual reports of the Bureau of Ethnology. There's open access via the Smithsonian Digital Library. So you can look at those. Bat Creek, we talked about that, Tennessee, 1889. It is held in the Smithsonian because, you know, they got to take everything. And then Cyrus Gordon wrote Diffusion of Near Eastern Culture in Antiquity and in Byzantine Times. He wrote that in 1971. Whew. Some more things to look at. Winthrop Jordan wrote White Over Black, American Attitudes Towards the Negro, 1550 to 1812. That's a good resource. It shows how the early explorers classified Black Indians and blurred the native African categories. Then Jack Forbes wrote Africans and Native Americans, the Language of Race and the Evolution of Red and Black Peoples. He had a key study of how native peoples of African appearance were gradually reclassified as Negro. And then William Loren Katz wrote Black Indians, A Hidden Heritage. So all of those are things that I used in pulling up this information. Those are all things that you can continue to look at. So, you know, what we're really looking at here is that a significant portion of those first called Black Indians were reclassified as Negro under systemic erasure. They call that paper genocide, right? Their laws, customs, and identity were tied to the House of Israel, actually, supporting the claim of a Hebrew presence in North America before Columbus and before the transatlantic slave trade. Hi, Leon. Thanks for being here. So that's where we're at now, is that we're going to start talking about the Hebrew part of that, because I think that we shared enough information to show that there were Black Indians here. It wasn't just one race of natives, the Siberian descended natives, over the entire continent. And I think one of the points that we brought up is that, you know, for hundreds of thousands of years, I'll say at least 100,000 years, on just about every continent, you know, not Antarctica, there were Black people. Because remember, humans were Black, which we find human remains that are 1 million, 2 million, up to 7 million years old. They were what we would consider Black, right? The first white happened about 40,000 years ago. That's the Neanderthals, who spawned as pale-skinned, no freckles, no melanin pools, no melanin spread, very light eyes, blonde hair. They spawned as white. And then the other type of white, which I have talked about on the show, there's genetically 2 different types of white. If you want to know more about that, you can look at my video, 2 Shades of Pale. The other kind of way, the mutated are people who have melanin pools and lack melanin spread, meaning that they are freckled. Okay. So that happened about 6,000 years ago. Two genetically different people, completely different alleles. So that's also where redheads kind of are in that same melanin pooling instead of melanin spread. So that was a mutation. So that's where we are. So now we're going to start into how Hebrews fit into this, because it's hard enough to make the argument that there were Black natives. They have tried so hard to erase that, that the paper genocide, right? Because if they relabeled those natives as Negro or colored or even mulatto, they were allowed by church and government to enslave them. So, of course, they have an impetus to do that. It's much cheaper and easier to enslave the people that are here on the land than it is to import, which they did that too. So they did that too. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up Adrian. He is here today, and we're going to get into the Hebrews in the Americas. Hi,
Hey,
Adrian. Thanks for being here.
hi, how are you? I'm sorry I'm late.
That's okay. It gave me plenty of time to get the recap.
Right,
Get the recap
right.
going.
I was
So,
listening to you, and just a quick sidebar. It's to me, it's not strange at all that the Mormons were so interested in and or kept records of all of this stuff. They keep pretty serious records. I think even in the ADOS community, when they talk about retracing your heritage as far as finding out whether or not you're actually or you're a descendant of someone that was in bondage or slavery. One of the resources that they use, if I'm not mistaken, is Mormon.
it's interesting given their beliefs. I'll
Yeah,
just say that.
though that yes, absolutely, that their belief system can be a little problematic where being melanated is concerned. Absolutely.
Right. They are very into that is the mark of Cain
Yeah.
BS. But I will say, while we're talking about that, if people are interested in in researching their lineage, there is something called the Brister English Project, Brister. This is run by an ADOS man, and he has done just tons and tons and tons of research. He has a lot of records and a lot of access to records. If you're looking to donate to anything, or if you were going to offer me money today, instead of doing that, donate to the Brister English Project, because he pays for all of that out of his own pocket.
Mm.
He doesn't get any money to do that. He's helped many people who come from a lineage of slavery to be able to find a lot of their people, and even back to ships and things like that, and some native ancestry. So he is great. And so I think if you're looking to do that, and you're ADOS, that would probably be a great place to start. You can always, add to it with whatever the Mormons have, but you have to pay for that, by the way. Those slave ship registries that MyHeritage, which is the Mormons, have, you have to pay for it. So if you're going to pay for it, give it to this guy,
There you go.
It's on my YouTube on the community tab, but it might be old enough that it's hard to find. So I'll try to find a link for the Brister English Project. All right. So are you ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
Okay. So the very first thing I wanted to start with is not necessarily proving that some of the Black natives that were here were Hebrew. And I'm saying some because, again, it's not all. People get very binary with things. It's all or none. I don't want to start there necessarily, but talk about when they did start shipping people in, trafficking people in for enslavement, they literally targeted Hebrew people.
Yeah. So in my research, I kind of tried to find the overlap of all of the countries in Africa that had populations of Hebrew people, which are vast. We're talking about, of course, Northern Africa, Egypt, Kush, those types of areas, but even getting into the Horn of Africa, down around South Africa, the Limba people, who were in South Africa and Zimbabwe, if my memory serves me correct. Um, but then there was quite a bit of activity um, for Black Hebrews who had been carrying on these traditions for thousands of years,
Yeah.
especially the Limba people. Um, but you get into I think what was it, Senegal, um, uh, Mali, um, the Gold Coast, um, Ghana, all of these areas, and obviously, to your point, these are West African nations, and this is where they pulled, you know, most of the Black Africans for the American slave trade.
Right. And unfortunately for them, they left receipts.
Hmm. Hmm.
So just to be clear, so that people understand, because so many words get interchanged nowadays. Um, Hebrew is not the same thing as Jew, which is not the same thing as Jewish, which is not the same exact thing as Israelite. So all of those seem to be interchanged. Somebody who is Hebrew is a descendant of Eber, who comes from Shem's line. If we're looking at the Noahic story, which, me, I say that's just the place name for the different hominid species. How people pass down the information of the hominid species. But so Hebrews are descendant of Eber. Then the tribes descending from Jacob, who became Israel, and his kin, there's the 13 tribes, right, were scattered through the African interior after the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Roman invasions. Okay. So we have historical evidence of this, not just biblical, right? Because we know that the tribe of Judah, which is where we get Jew from,
Hmm.
the first thing that they did was absorb the tribe of Levi. So the tribe of Levi got assimilated into the tribe of Judah. It was all the rest of the tribes that got scattered. The tribe of Judah did not. Okay. So by the time the transatlantic slave trade, right, many Hebrews were living among the West African tribes under different ethnonyms. Okay. So you have the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Akan, the Ashanti, the Yui, you have these names, and these are people who are still, to what you said, still practicing all of these Hebrew traditions.
Hmm.
Okay,
In
because
fact,
Eber was their great grandfather. Sorry, go
in
ahead.
fact, the Limba people, something I was watching, I can't recall, but the Limba people, some of them had, some of the tribal elders had made, a comment about the fact that the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim wanted them to convert into what they were doing. And they're like, why would we convert into something that we've been doing for thousands of years now?
Right, they have the longest continuing practice.
Hmm.
And that's
Hmm.
something that's brought up about, the hate that they call them beta Israelites.
Right.
But because, they're actually should be called alpha, right? Because
Alphas. Right.
they have the longest continuing
Yeah.
practice of any, right? More than the Sephardic, the Mizrahi, the
Hmm.
Ashkenazim. They have, the thousands and thousands of years of practice.
And wouldn't it
So,
make sense? I mean, stuff coming up out of South Africa into the rest of the world, into Yemen. I mean, they were talking about these people, the Limba, have genetic markers that make them claim, to being heirs of the original priesthood, right? These are
right.
ancient people.
I think that's the tribe of Levi. If I
Okay.
remember right, the Levites, which is where we get the term levitation, by the way, were the spiritual people. They were the spiritual practitioners. They were
Brothers
the
was floating.
priests.
Okay.
Yes. But apparently, that's also where we get the term levitation from, which is very interesting. But yeah,
Yeah, very.
if I'm
First time
remembering
I've heard
correctly,
that.
yeah, the tribe of Levi were the priests
Okay.
of all the tribes. So there are some European and Jewish writers who wrote about this.
Okay.
So we have Olada Equiano. I know I'm saying that wrong. 1745 to 1797. Okay. He's an Igbo freedman. Okay. Observed that his people's customs resembled, but not exactly like those of the Israelites.
Hmm.
Okay. And to your point, it's because they had continuous practice. And as these other groups, formed, whether that was from actually Semitic people or from European people, the practices and the rituals were different and they changed, right? But they had the same, they were performing circumcision. And so I don't think circumcision is something you just accidentally land on doing. I
Right.
think that literally has to be something that is passed down to even think to do that, right?
Right.
So they had circumcision. They had the same exact dietary laws. They had the same ritual washings, and they were celebrating similar festivals. So those are pretty big things. When we say they're similar, those are big things.
Yeah.
And then in the 18th and 19th century, writers, both African and European, remarked that Igbo, Ashanti, Yoruba, and other West African peoples practiced rites that were almost exact to Mosaic law. So these are people who are coming in to colonize. They don't, they wouldn't have anything to gain by lying about that.
Right.
They're there to colonize, doesn't matter. So some rabbis and missionaries explicitly argued that West African captives were remnants of the lost tribes of Israel. So these are rabbis and missionaries. So they're trying to get colonizers to stop capturing and trafficking these West Africans because they were the lost tribes.
Yeah. They're important people in
Right,
their area. Yeah.
right. So the other thing that when I first started looking into this, the way I looked into it or what I first came across was that when we look at the records of people who were enslaved, right? They don't write down their names or, anything like that, but they write down where they're captured from and a descriptor. And so they might say more, but more often than not, they will say things like Israelite. They will say things like Hebrew. This is what I mean when they left records, unfortunate for them. And you can tell by the records that they were disproportionately targeting West and West Central African regions and specifically targeting these Israelite descended groups. who after the Roman exile, they went into the interior of Africa.
This is what's always been interesting for me about like this whole topic of this period of time. Um, like these people knew who they were going after. Right. There
Yeah.
wasn't anything mysterious about it. This history doesn't have to be mysterious. Stuff was written down. People kept records.
Right.
People knew what they were going after. It's again, it's the same thing that makes me scratch my head. In the previous video, when I was saying that there was, and you said it even in the recap today, there was black people everywhere except for Antarctica. And so
Because
it's just
nobody was in Antarctica. It's not that there was just white people,
right.
nobody was there.
It's kind of cold and we don't like that. But anyway, um, but just mysteriously there was nobody here in North America. I mean, really, come on, so yeah, and I mean, we're talking about the 15th century. The world was, I'm not going to say super modern, but it was modern enough. It was fairly modern enough. Like you
Mhm.
said, there's established language and civilizations that have risen and fallen by this point. This isn't the Stone Ages. This
Right.
in
And
the whole
they
history of the
show
world, this wasn't long ago.
right. And we see all the evidence that there were a lot of places in Africa, especially along the coast, that had ships that were for long sea voyages. So, and then they're like, well, but the current to go across and blah, blah, blah. Well, just because the Europeans struggled with that, who were newer
Right.
to ship faring, doesn't mean that the Africans hadn't figured it out. And
Yeah,
I think the other thing,
they still
sorry,
haven't successfully built this pyramid yet, even in the modern era. So
correct. But I think the other thing that we see too is that there were Black peoples in Central and South America prior to being in North America.
Mhm,
Well, that's a much easier voyage
mhm,
to go from the South and go north, just like the Siberian Native Americans were north and went south. And
mhm,
when you look at the tribal maps, you see it because the whole south side of North America are all of these Black Indian tribes
mhm.
from the south side of California all the way to almost the entirety of Florida.
I mean, have you been to Wisconsin? It's kind of cold.
It's
I said we
cold,
don't like that, right? So
right?
we're gonna
So
Florida. That's where
the
we'll be.
Siberian tribes, who are very used to the cold, stayed north, right? And the Black tribes stayed in the south. And it was just because that's where they came in from. And it's not it is logical. I don't get why people, well, I get why some people have a problem with it,
Yeah.
but why other people who don't have any stake in that game will argue and fuss and fight about it. It's only logical.
Hmm.
So, Bob, thank you for being here. He said Hebrews looked like that. And this is what I'm going to say, Bob, is that when we look at, if we just go biblically, right, and not look at any historical documents, right? If we just look biblically, right, Hebrews are come from Eber, okay? Eber is a grandson of Shem, right? We have Ham, Shem, Japheth, okay? So in the Hebrew writings, which includes the Old Testament, so we're just looking at biblical or Torah, we're not looking at Talmudic. If we just look at those, God said to Ham, God created Ham dark black as a raven. He created Japheth white, and he created Shem as black and comely, meaning black and beautiful. So then when we look at when is the advent of whiteness, and whiteness, would then mix in and create like Arabs, Spain would go in and colonize in Central and South America and create lighter, races, things like that, then what we're looking at, obviously, is that the original Hebrews would have been black and comely. They would have been black and beautiful, black and good looking. Okay. Which I kind of feel for Ham, because it makes it sound like Ham's not good looking, right? Because he's black and just as a raven.
Right.
Right. He's just black like a bird. Okay. But that was how it was described. And so even just going by that and not pulling in all the archaeological evidence of, our bloodlines, a vast majority of the world came from Black people. There was only one hominid line that spawned white, and that was the Neanderthals. And even to this day, people that we say have high Neanderthal DNA content, max, it's like 5%.
Mm-hmm.
So all the rest of their DNA came from a Black lineage. And this is the part that I think people get confused on, because they think to themselves, oh, at one point I was Black, now I am white. It's that binary thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just use myself as an example. My lineage, goes back to Cheddar Man, and before goes back to the Congo area, Central Africa. Mm-hmm. When we look at my ancestors, that doesn't mean that at one point I was Black and one point I was white. It means this is my lineage and this is what I look like today. Now I can study DNA and those kind of things. And of course I understand about the 2 shades of pale, and that I have a mutation that created freckles. So, I don't have the melanin spread anymore. But if we just look at our ancestry as this is our human development, instead of the whole black and white dichotomy, I think we'd be better off. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that, Adrian?
And, that's not to say that in the next, 1,000 years, Maggie, as it were, won't look, totally different.
Right, because
it ebbs and flows. Yeah, yep. Absolutely. It ebbs and flows. That's as you asked me what my thoughts are about it, that's what I want to add to it. Other than Marjorie Taylor Greene, I mean, nobody has ever been always white forever.
Right. But only because
I don't know why we've latched onto her.
Well, because she looks just like that, the wax dummy in the museum of a Neanderthal woman. They look exactly the same. Mm-hmm. So, and she has a lot of the patterns. She has the supraorbital ridge, where right. Like the eyebrow area comes out. Mm-hmm. She has a lot of those. So, but, I've done a lot of shows on those kind of things. But I think when we're talking about this and how, who was targeted to be trafficked, who was targeted to be enslaved, and it was these Hebrew people. I think that speaks to one of the, silly things that we hear is, well, Black people sold Black people. Well, part of that, one of the things that I will say is that, yes, there were some phenotypically Black people who never in a million years would have called themselves Black, because nobody in Africa was calling themselves Black. That was just human, right? They were tribes and ethnicities and different things that they identified with. So there were some who had some captives that sold them to the Europeans, but for the most part, the Europeans went in on raiding parties, and they hired people for raiding parties. The people that they trafficked, they didn't buy all of them from these little tiny tribes. Right. It just did not happen that way. It was raiding parties. So yeah, there were some, and obviously slavery meant something very, very different at that time than chattel slavery. So they didn't know what they were selling these people into. So, but I think that speaks to it, is that these were different kind of ethnicities or regional people who were not selling their own people. They were
Right.
selling these sort of Hebrew descended, black and beautiful people who had dispersed to the, I'm not going to quit saying it, who had
I
dispersed
see you're not.
to the center of the continent, right? To the in the West. So
Well, and some of the information that I had pulled up was that uh, some of these Hebrew groups had, particular skills. If I remember correctly, when they had gone into Babylonia, they were scribes,
mhm,
at the time. Later it talks about them in agriculture, metalworking,
right.
things like
Metallurgy is a
that,
big one.
metallurgy.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, if I'm going to get somebody, I want somebody that has, some particular skills that they can bring to the table.
right.
Yeah.
So then when we see the enslaved that so they took the enslaved population, the trafficked population, and brought them in to bolster up the population of people that they had already enslaved, the Black natives that they had enslaved. And so then they start bringing people in, and eventually they get to forced breeding. But one of the things that we see is that the enslaved Africans carried their Hebrew naming patterns, songs, and practices. Okay. So some, and this are things that I looked up was that in spirituals, enslaved Africans tended to, while they would talk about Jesus a lot, they would tend to make songs that pertain to the Old Testament about Moses and things like that. So
Mm.
a lot of the songs had more to do with a Hebrew identity. Now, obviously, they weren't allowed to pass down these rituals from person to person, through their descendants. But these were things that other people had observed. Now, somebody did bring up that they retained Hebrew names like Judah, Levi, and Benjamin among enslaved Africans in records. But I think we have to bear in mind that if they were enslaved, they were not naming themselves. So, people giving biblical names to people that they were enslaving was more of a them practice than it was Black people naming their children those
Yeah, might
names.
have come from those Christians, but
Yeah. Adric says, Black, beautiful, dark, and lovely.
yeah.
I like it. Yeah. And then he also says, transhumanism, see you in 3025, which would likely be when everybody's Black again. Everything happens cyclically, right? And oh, wait, I don't want to say that because I'll get the freakos that want to talk about replacement and BS.
Right.
So forget I said that. Forget I said that. Because somebody will freak out about it. Okay, so talked about Oleda Equiano, 1789. He wrote the interesting narrative of the life of Oladai Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African. That's a very long title, but that whole thing is the title. Equiano, who's Igbo, explicitly notes parallels between the Igbo customs and those of ancient Israel. So he is Igbo, writing
Okay.
about the Igbo. We don't need to come in and tell him that he's wrong.
Right.
So if he says they're the same customs back in 1789, then they were the same customs. And then we have Edward Blyden. He's in the 1800s Pan-African scholar. He wrote Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. And he notes that Hebrew and Israelite cultural survivals among West African peoples.
Real quick,
So,
the first one that you mentioned, what year did you say he wrote his work?
1789.
So what motivation would he even have to lie to anyone at that point? It wasn't like there's this big hotbed controversy of, where people came from. No, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
what would be his motivation? Oh, he's a liar in 1789. I
Well,
mean,
and it was just his memoirs. It's called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olida Equiano.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like he had some massive YouTube channel back then that he was wanting to try to
Right.
promote, you know.
He wanted to say something just daring and
Yeah,
salacious.
something provocative, you know what I mean?
Right. He's just writing about himself.
He was trying to get
Vincent
on the
even
Pierce
said,
Morgan show back then, you know what I'm saying?
yeah.
So,
Vincent even said Nation of Islam. So that's in there too, because of Isaac, that's Abrahamic as well. So those are some voices that we can look at. But then there were some European and Jewish observations, which they would have no good reason to lie about this at all.
right.
Right. So Joseph J. Williams in 1930 wrote Hebrewisms of West Africa.
Mm.
So he was collecting missionary reports describing the Mosaic style practices, including circumcision, dietary laws, and ritual purification among the Akan, the Ashanti, the Yoruba, and the Igbo. All were doing these Hebrew practices.
You said this was in 1930? This was
Let me
written.
look at the year again to make sure. 1930.
Yeah. So, I mean, even then in 1930, there wouldn't have been any real reason to fudge the numbers or the information.
No, and this is a European guy.
Mm-hmm.
This is a white guy.
Yeah, black folks well, I can only really speak for America. They were in a completely subjugated place with no real at the time, not much positive outlook for social change or equity or equality. So, the information just was what it was, but it wasn't going to change the material condition of black
Right.
folks anywhere, at that time. So why lie about it?
Right. And then Henry Rawlinson, 19th century, this was the 1800s. His writings often observed Semitic or Israelite parallels in West African tribal practices. So this Henry Rawlinson, he's noticing the same things amongst these tribes, that these tribes are practicing Hebrew or Mosaic or Israelite or all three religious practices in the same exact areas that were targeted for enslavement. And then on those enslavement records, they noted that these people were Hebrew. They said it themselves. So if people want to look for more information, Tudor Parfit, that's a name, by the way, wrote The Lost Tribes of Israel, The History of a Myth. It documents how Europeans interpreted Igbo, Lemba, and others as Israelite tribes. So Europeans interpreted them that way. So we know when they targeted them, it wasn't accidental. Chouki El Hamel wrote Black Morocco, A History of Slavery, Race, and Islam. Right? It covers Jewish and Hebrew presences in Africa and their targeting in the slave trade. So that's a really good one. He has some manifests in his writing. And then Albert Roboto wrote Slave Religion, the Invisible Institution in the Antebellum South. So he shows how enslaved Africans used Exodus and Israelite narratives because they recognized themselves in the Hebrew story. Now that doesn't specifically state, that they had that they were able to pass that down. But I think a lot of people see parallels in how Black Americans, ADOS people, have been treated and what they've gone through, and the story in Exodus. So, but I will talk about that I can talk about it now. Do you want me to talk about the biblical parallels?
Let's go.
Okay. So, these are the biblical parallels. Okay. Deuteronomy 28:68, interpreted by enslaved Africans and later Black Hebrew groups as prophecy of the middle passage. Okay. And I'll get into the quotes in a minute. Um, so no, I'll get into it now. I didn't mean to load. Okay. Verse 68. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. Ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen. So bondmen and bondwomen are people who put other people in bondage. That's what bondmen and bondwomen are. So, and the
Okay.
Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again, right, which is into enslavement again with ships. Now, what other people were brought into enslavement by ship? Anybody in the comments?
None that I can think of, for sure.
Right, and there aren't, right? So then we go, because millions of Africans were taken by ship into slavery into foreign lands, right? Egypt is interpreted symbolically as the house of bondage.
And
Okay.
is it just me, or does it seem like for most of slavery's history, and I'm not talking about transatlantic, it seemed to be like a local practice,
Yeah.
right? Like you enslaved those people who just live right over there, right?
Yeah.
You brought them over here. Um, but I haven't, and I could be wrong. I'm, wrong a lot, but it just didn't seem like there was much practice where people were going all the way onto the other side of the globe. Bringing people from one side, one hemisphere to another,
Mhm.
to do that.
Yeah. In looking at the practice of slavery, that's why I'm very clear to say chattel slavery versus slavery, because the way slavery was practiced, it was part of a social order, part of like a caste. And
Uh-huh.
so those on the very bottom were their caste, their class was slave, meaning they relied on their quote unquote master for to survive, for food, for clothing, for because they didn't have anything. The interesting thing is though, because this was a social caste, they were allowed to go home and they
Hmm.
could have a spouse at home who was not a slave or did not work for a master or did something completely different, but still got to come home. And when they had children, their children weren't taken from them and enslaved. If they could provide for their child didn't need to do anything. They weren't automatically owned by the master. These masters didn't necessarily own these people, they were providing for them, um, and getting work from them. Now, were they good masters? I don't know. I'm sure they overworked people because there's greedy, crappy people all over the place.
Right.
But
An
slavery,
oligarch is going to oligarch.
right? Indentured servitude is very different, and the history of slavery is very, very different. There were people who literally sold themselves into slavery because they couldn't make it. They didn't have money. Very similarly to people who will commit petty crimes to go to jail for the weekend because it's cold.
Well, we saw this in European populations,
Yes.
that wanted to indenture themselves to a more well-to-do family just to be able to afford to come over to America because they didn't
Right.
have the means to do so otherwise.
Yep.
You know,
Because you would get that if you put yourself into indentured servitude, well, the Irish especially, you got land at the end
mm,
of your contract.
I didn't know that.
And your spouse and child were not automatically enslaved or indentured.
Hmm.
You
It's
you
it's
could
funny.
be
We
married.
we
Sorry.
we're in this interesting week, obviously, with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I ended up in a one-on-one conversation with a minister who he and I weren't seeing from the same sheet of music over this whole Kirk situation. And he goes into the normal, well, slavery was a global practice thing, and I had to, recount some of this history of slavery, and he had to concede that slavery was different because even from the Bible that he reads from and preaches from, there's stories in the Bible, and once I started down that track, he's already started. Okay, I get it, because it was this slave owned this much land, and the master made him lord over all of these people. That's not
Mhm.
the same kind of slavery that my
It could be
my
very
ancestors come from.
feudal,
Yeah,
you know? And you would also see stories in the Bible of, enslaved people taking trips and stuff, like going to
yeah,
visit family members and
right,
right, because slavery was part of the class system. It was like their job title.
right.
They weren't not human. They were still humans in that system. So very, very different. Um, but yeah, there were people that sold themselves into indentured servitude because you could have land.
Right. So much
So
different practice.
so when people are like, what about the Irish? Well, indentured servitude is completely different. Was indentured servitude good? No. Their people were treated terribly because they are bringing people from another country over here who have no support system. There's no oversight here. um, as an example, my great grandmother and her sister were sold into indentured servitude by their parents, and the things that happened to them were atrocious. So I think I heard somebody else say we don't have to exaggerate what happened to the Irish and somehow
Right,
make it take the place of slavery. and
right,
and what about the Irish? Because what happened to the Irish was bad enough.
right.
But it's a totally separate thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so we talked about ships, right? So while what we would call Jews today, which is it's not exactly the same thing as Hebrews or Israelites, um, while Jews faced enslavement, if we give it with Babylon, Rome, Egypt, whatever, there's no historical record of mass transport by ships as described. So the Holocaust did involve deportations, but everything happened within the rail system
I was gonna say
in
that's
Europe.
trains. That's different. Doesn't count.
Yes,
I'm joking.
yes. Um, so verses 36 to 37. Thou shalt serve other gods, thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations. So African Americans for centuries were called Negro, or they were called colored, or they were called slaved, right? Always stripped of original tribal names, forced into Christianity, forced under oppression, right? Have to. So the proverb byword status is visible in all the reclassifications and in racial slurs and stereotypes. So modern Jews maintained their religious continuity, the Torah, the Hebrew, the synagogue, all of that, even under persecution. They
Right.
never they never were made into forced to be something that they're not.
Yeah,
Now, though they were
they saw the Moors coming into the Iberian Peninsula as liberators, from their dispensation under the Visigoths, but they were never not, Jews in
not
terms of how
Jews,
they
they were
practice.
never not Jews,
Hmm.
and they got to be Jews.
Hmm.
And
They were just
then,
treated poorly, by the
yeah,
Visigoths
treated
at the time.
terribly,
Yeah.
right? But they still got to be the Jews. Then we have verse 32. Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look, but there shall be no might in thine hand. So for African Americans, families definitely were torn apart on auction blocks, right? Children were sold away from them, which is something we just talked about, that in slavery, prior to chattel slavery, the children weren't, en masse taken and sold away, weren't automatically the property of somebody else. But in chattel slavery, uniquely, yes, that
The
happened.
condition of the mother followed
Is
to the
your
child.
condition. Yep.
Right.
So for modern Jews, the pogroms and the Holocaust, which are terrible things, and they separated families, but those were episodes. That wasn't generational or systemic over centuries, the way it has been for African Americans, that thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people. All the sons and daughters taken away and given to someone else, and there's nothing you can do about it. There shall be no might in thine hand. You can't do anything about it. So that's one of those, the Deuteronomy curses. Then we have verse 48. Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in want of all things. So African Americans, plantation slavery, chattel slavery matches almost word for word on that. Forced servitude, dependent on the masters for food, clothing, shelter. You have nothing, in want of all things.
Not even education.
Right. You own nothing, not even yourself. You own nothing, right? So modern Jews experienced restrictions, right? In ghettos, poverty in medieval Europe, those kind of things, but not universal enslavement of the whole nation being put into foreign lands. That just never happened. Then we have verse 45. Moreover, all these curses shall come upon thee till thou be destroyed, because thou hearkenest not unto the voice of the Lord. So we have African Americans following along these curses, right? From slavery to Jim Crow, mass incarceration, systemic racism, continuous oppression, across 400 years. The modern Jews have periods of oppression, expulsions, pogroms, Holocaust, but also long stretches of acceptance, prosperity, and power. We have the Golden Age in Spain, modern Israel, US influences, all of that is there. And so it's not, I say that to say, people don't need to get into, see, it's the curse of Ham. This is a totally different curse. All right. This is Yahweh having a conversation with his chosen people, right? The Hebrews, the Israelites.
Along the lines of the points that you were just making, just a moment ago, even when they're displaced, they still, become the major financial or otherwise influence of the place that they land. Even well, we were just talking about it a few lives ago when speaking about the Sephardim in the Iberian Peninsula. They were still able to even under I guess the what's the word I'm looking for here? Under kind of the oppression of the of having to either be a converso or what was that time period called? It was the Inquisition. Even under those periods of time, they're still able to be influential in the burgeoning slave trade that was to come. We talked about them having plantations the size of Portugal in some in some areas, or being agents in Africa and slave outposts. They still had a lot of economic power. Weren't there? Didn't we talk about some folks in the land in different areas having issues with them coming in and just kind of taking over financially?
Yeah, I think that's when we were talking about the plantations. That those huge plantations. Because the size of Portugal, I mean, you can't walk your plantation. You can't, I mean, even with a horse, it's going to take you days to get from one end to the other. And, there are people who are there living in that area. Like, what's up with that?
Right. Sounds like a totally different dispensation to me than, chattel slavery here in North America.
Right. And the last one that I'm going to go over, and this is the last thing that I have, is verse 65. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, but the Lord shall give thee a trembling heart and a failing of eyes and a sorrow of mind. So for African Americans, this forced migration, being trafficked, being still marginalized, the ongoing struggles with systemic inequality, having no home country, and that they can return to because Africa is fragmented by colonialism. And again, this may be the homeland, especially if they're native and aboriginal. It's you don't get to know among these nations where you've been sent to and fragmented to, you shall find no ease. There's no rest, right?
Yeah.
So the
You're
modern
saying
Jew,
colonialism in the continent. I don't even know if that's the bigger issue. As far as what we see with ADOS Black Americans, FBA Black Americans, whatever you want to call themselves, versus continental Africans, the bigger issue is what tribe you belong to.
right? And if you
And
don't know, then
yeah,
you can get bullied by African tribes
hmm
because while the powers that be or white supremacy or whatever, or ignorant people view Black people as a monolith, Black people, heavily melanated people, encompass a lot of ethnicities.
hmm
Um,
yeah. I
and
bumped into a guy today, and I just looked at him and I asked him. I said, "Are you from Eritrea?" He said, "How'd you know?" So I can just look at you and tell. We're different. We're very and we're very distinct from as far as where we come from.
mhm. And look, I mean, it's different ethnicities, so obviously
Mhm.
people look different.
Yeah.
But it's, and you and I have talked about this in Europe. If I was to travel to England, um, everybody in England would see me and say, "Oh, are you Welsh?" And I can see people and tell that they're Welsh, but because there's not a ton of Welsh people here, it's
hmm
hard for people to distinguish that, right?
hmm
Just to give people a little bit of a caveat, although some of it I think is just ignorance. It's not, that whole go back to Africa. Well, Africa's not ADOS people's home. So, this whole go back to Africa, how about all of humanity go back to Africa then? Because we all
Right.
have roots there, except the Neanderthals who did not spawn in Africa. They're
No.
the only exception. So,
Wow. That's crazy.
isn't that wild?
It
It's
is.
the
It
only
is actually.
hominid exception.
Mm.
So, when I say no rest among the nations, the modern Jews suffered exile and anti Semitism, but now have a recognized homeland. They have significant political power, economic power, especially in Western nations. We watched a video where there were families getting on a boat to go watch the bombings in Gaza so they could pick out their plots of land after everybody was, killed and smeared off of those
The land.
lands.
Yeah.
So that's something that a lot of people bring up, is that when you look at the curses, not just the curses, but even the blessings too in Deuteronomy, because it's curses and blessings,
Mm.
um, it fits ADOS Americans way better than Ashkenazim and the Ashkenazi Jews. So, but it also fits Beta Israelites as well,
Right.
because colonialism didn't stop. It was going on in Africa before the transatlantic slave trade, and obviously they were targeting specific people. And then it's an interesting thing when we look at who were they targeting for slavery in North America when they first came, and that was Black natives, who also included some Hebrew Black natives who had come here prior, and then they go and target more Hebrew people, Black Hebrew people, to be enslaved. And so it's sort of like there is a through line there of this Hebrewness, this being a Shemite, which is, by the way, for people who don't know, that's where we get the word Semite from. So anybody descended from Shem, from Shem's lineage, is a Semite. So, when we start showing that ADOS Americans have Hebrew lineage, then anti-Black racism is anti-Semitism. Okay, number one. Number two, Ashkenazi Jews descend from Japheth. And it's not just me that says that. They say that. They named themselves the Ashkenazi, and Ashkenaz is a grandson of Japheth, the white son of Noah. So it's very odd how being against whatever they're doing and making any sort of critique about what they're doing is called anti-Semitism, when people in Palestine actually are Semites and Black Americans are Semites. but
Well, unfortunately now, there's been a complete taking over of that brand, right? We won't even see what's happening in Gaza right now as anti-Semitism. You have a whole region full of Semites, and one group gets to claim the franchise, and all others are,
yeah. And if you
interesting,
have anything negative to say, you're anti-Semitic.
right? So good luck for ADOS Americans being seen as Semites at any point in the future. At this point,
I think something really interesting we can end on is answering Bob's question. I'm going to put it up. I'm going to let you go first. We'll answer Bob's question. Nope, not that one. This one. There we go. You see the question?
yeah.
It's a good question, and it's something you and I have talked about.
Who's the enemy? Yeah, I don't know that I can answer that question without being really, really polarizing. I'm not going to do that to your channel. So,
Appreciate
who's
you.
the enemy? Yeah, who's the enemy? I think and this is a really sanitized answer. I think the enemy is anyone who either refuses to, or in some sort of malicious way, hides the truth about our human history. I think that's the enemy. You know, um, we could have the society that we want, we could have the countries that we want, we could have the world that we want. If not for greedy individuals who want it all for themselves. And
Okay.
that's as sanitized an answer as I think I can give.
Just a reminder to Adric, you have a wrench and the ability to time out. And I give people wrenches because I trust their discernment. So what I would say about who is the enemy, I will sound conspiratorial, like conspiracy theories when I answer this, but you guys know that I like tinfoil hats. So, I talk about conspiracies a lot because a lot of times conspiracies end up being true. But I think it is literally specific families who have descended from specific Neanderthal lineages who remained blue bloods and those royal lines. It's better known today as the 13 families. I think you probably have never heard most of their names. You've heard Rothschilds and you've heard Rockefellers, but there are 13 families. They're more well known in England, by the way. People talk about them. So, yeah. I think those people, and I've talked about before, there are two different caste systems. of the West, and it's turning into global, where you have elitism on the top, and you have these 13 families with their hangers on and people that are orbiting around them. And then you have the lower caste system, of which is the reality that we live in. And like the top of the caste system, the bottom caste system, is the people in government that control us with the permission of the top caste. So that's how I think the enemy is. It's very similar to me. If you've ever seen that picture where like you see these global elites playing like a board game
On everybody's back.
Right. Instead of a table, it's like people who are on all fours. And if we just stood up, the game would be over. And I say this a lot, that the reality that they sell us, you have to question it. You have to question why they taught us what they taught us. And do we need to keep playing the game?
Yeah, the reality that they sold us is that we need them.
Right. It's similar to old school slavery, that we require them for food and clothing and water and electricity, and all we have to do is sell our time to them through means of work. We stopped selling our bodies. We stopped putting ourselves in indentured servitude or putting ourselves into slavery. We just became workers. So we sell our time for survival. And then over time, we forgot how to just live on the planet from which we spawned. Like we forgot how to just like feed ourselves, and build ourselves shelter and things like that we did for millions of years. So, it's worked out for them so far.
It's true. I believe it. Good conversation.
Loved it. So, at some point, we may want to talk about Namibia. I had it on for today, but we're all at almost an hour and a half. So we can talk about Namibia another time.
Yeah. Are you talking about it from the standpoint of the Holocaust first trial run?
I'm talking, that's part of it, but I'm talking about
or who those people were.
Yeah. And how where they are is much closer to the biblical writings of the homeland.
We'll say the Sa people, I think. Correct? Yeah.
So we can talk about that another time, but I appreciate you being here. We always have great conversations.
Absolutely. I love being here. This is great.
Awesome. So for those of you watching, we're going to continue on Wednesday with the Book of Knowledge, the Keys of Enoch. And then next Sunday, we're going to be doing the trope, but the Indians own slaves. So we're going to talk about that. So, and what that was about and what that meant, and who were those people. So we're going to talk about that next Sunday. So if I don't see you this coming Wednesday, I hope to see you next Sunday. And before I forget, I love you, I miss you, and you're my favorite. Now I'm going to show you a picture of my dog. Please like the video if you haven't already. It really helps the algorithm to know what kind of things you like. Share where you think it's appropriate, especially to someone who you think needs to hear it. And don't forget to check out some of the wilder Pivot Point Wednesday shows. And last, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, especially if you want to break down complex concepts that make the esoteric not so teric, helping you on your journey to become your most authentic self. By subscribing, you'll join a community that thrives on curiosity and growth, and you'll never miss out on insights and some wild discussions. Let's uncover the universe together. Bye.